Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We could also say a good and freilichen end of Shushan Purim. And actually in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, it's called a Purim Mishulish. Purim is not over until at the end of Sunday. There's halachas of Purim on Friday, as it was b'chutz laretz, or anywhere outside of a city that was surrounded by wall. There's a Shushan Purim, which is of course the Purim Yerushalayim, because it's Shabbos. There are things that are done on Sunday. So indeed, we're still, being that we daven toward Yerushalayim and our minds are with Yerushalayim all the time, we're still in the middle of Purim with all the simcha and all the power of Purim. So it should be a freiliche year, a freiliche tamid forever for Jews. We say in Havdalah, Kain Ti Alonu, in the fullest sense of the word. And just as in Persia of all, B'yomim Ahim, B'zman Hazeh, Hayomim Me'elin, Niskarim V'nasim, there should be the destruction of our enemies, the Persia of our times, Iran, and its negative forces and evil forces, and its proxies, and Hamas, similar to Haman, with the same intentions. Should be lahabid, complete the elimination of our enemies, and again, Lo Yehudim Heisa Erev V'simcha V'sosin V'yikar. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it's in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Alevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Hashalom, and since Chus Merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we are in the middle of chapter 24, Perek Chav Daled, being that we're also coming from Purim. And as I said, Yerushalayim, it's a Purim Mishulish. So we talked about this last week as well. Purim is so much about Mechias Amalek, elimination of Amalek, and his pedigree, his descendants, namely Haman HaGogi, as we mark and as we trample on the ground when we hear his name, to remember that the Zocher Tishkach Machei Timche Zecher Amalek. Why? Because Amalek represents, as it says in Sfarim, Sofik, Gematria Sofik, and it represents Krirus, Asher Korcha B'derech. All the negative forces, in a sense, represents the Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh HaBamis, which is so central theme in Tanya. It represents all the forces that try to conceal, to cool off, to create apathy, and to challenge and impede our ability to serve Hashem with full passion and vitality with the Nefesh Halikis, which is, as I said, so central to the theme of Tanya. So it's very appropriate and fitting to what we're learning. So what we learned can help us understand Purim, and Purim can help us understand the Tanya. So in that context, what are we up to? In chapter 24, discussing Hakarev Elecha Dover Me'ed. It's already a theme that began in chapter 18, but specifically in chapter 20, with the Alter Rebbe is coming to explain that in addition to everything we learned in the first 17 chapters, and namely from chapter 9, 10, 11, especially 12 and on, about how through our Avodah and our contemplation we can learn self-control, self-mastery, so that the impulsive emotions of the animal soul can be subdued, can be tamed, can be controlled by the reflective power of the mind of the divine soul, and with all the different levels of that, higher levels, lower levels, essentially what the Beinoni is, has a Yetzer Hara, has an Nefesh HaBamis, which is active. However, he's able to keep it controlled, at least the thought, speech, and action in our levushim, in the garments, are not affected. So the battle is there. And again, the different levels, whether it's his midas bizgalus libay, talumas libay, we learned in chapters 16 and 17. So then in chapter 18, the Alter Rebbe began and said, so that's a Korav Elecha Dover made through Avodah. Then comes another aspect of it, that every neshama has a ava mesuteres, a natural love for Hashem. It's a concealed love. It's dormant. And he explains Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, like a flame. A natural flame naturally is always reaching upward. So too the neshama is always a transcendent entity seeking God. And that's there in every neshama, every neshama. However, it's concealed. Unless there's a crisis, in a state of emergency, where someone's threatened, like in a case where you're threatened with your life or avodah zarah, and a person will give up their life, even a kal shebekalim, and Peishi Yisrael, as he said, someone who's transgressed and who's lax in Judaism and commitment, because there a line has been crossed, and that touches. It's like when a person's in danger, suddenly it touches the very core of who you are, and that he won't do. That demonstrates that it's there. But the question is, that's there only in a time of emergency. So yes, obviously when a fire is burning, people act differently when things are calmer. But where's the Kodev Elecha Dover Me'ed Befichel Belvavchel Asei? Where's that Ava Mesoteres connection all the time? So you would think the only other way is back to the chapters before chapter 18, through Aveda, through his Bonus. Says the Alter Rebbe, no. And that begins an explanation in chapters 20, all the way through chapter 25. We're now in chapter 24, to explain that the truth is, not just in a time of sakanah, at a time when we're threatened, but all the time. Because godliness ain't eid milvadeh. The only true reality is God. Everything else, like he explains, is just the words of God. What's one word compared to the source of all the words? Explain that length in chapters 19, chapters 20, 21. And there he explained also, therefore, that Anochi and Lo Yelecha, the two cardinal mitzvahs that declare, number one, the utter, seamless, and all-pervasive unity of Hashem, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and also negating the opposite, Lo Yelecha Lekim Acherim, that everything else, meaning anything that's not godly, is the antithesis to godly unity, and that the first, Anochi, is the root and source and encompasses all positive mitzvahs, and Lo Yelecha encompasses all negative mitzvahs. That tells us that all mitzvahs, not just avodah zarah, not just when we're threatened, but all mitzvahs, no matter what mitzvah, is ultimately a force that unites us with godliness. And if you're over on anything, even what we would call something relatively lenient, is defying the seamless unity of the divine. So when you think of that, then it's not just in a time when we're struggling, or a time where I should say a crisis. All times, that divine unity is all prevailing. And as such, Kodev Elecha Dover Me'ed. Now, of course, you say, well, someone has to contemplate on that. And we're talking now of someone who may not be capable of contemplating. So obviously, this section in Tanya from chapter 18 and on is talking about everybody. Those that could contemplate, even people on a high level that can create and actually midas bizgalus libe, as well as those betalumis libe, which at least the mind tells you it's appropriate to love God, as we learned back then. What about the kal shebekalim? So the Alter Rebbe is telling us the mitzias, the existence. Doesn't mean everyone necessarily understands this level of Ein Eid Milvad, but everyone can be explained that there's one God. And everything else is part of that divine unity, and if it's not, it's the antithesis to divine unity. It's like Elokim Acherim. So everything becomes like avodah zarah as long as it's not godliness. You don't need actual idolatry. Because you're essentially saying there's one speck of existence, one fiber that is not acknowledging the divine unity. And the same, the opposite. Like we learned that mitzvahs, and even more so Torah, every mitzvah and Torah create that unity because they're not subject to the concealment. Because how is it possible that a person should transgress? How is it possible that a person should not know of all this? Because there's a concealment. And as we learned, in this chapter, that there's a concealment, a moment of insanity, a moment of delusion, a blindness that doesn't allow you to see that unity. In other words, it's not due to just the desire, it's not due to the desire of a taiva. It's because we don't see the effect, we don't see the divine unity. So we could think, I could do something and I'm not being burned. It's like putting your hand in fire and you don't know it's fire, or you don't know that the fire hurts you. So that's all due to the tzimtzumim. However, Torah mitzvahs, we're talking about positive mitzvahs, as Leivarim de Malka, the 248 divine organs, that connects us because a mitzvah is not subject to this concealment. So when you do a mitzvah, you're realigning yourself to that unity. And even more so with Torah, like we learned at Aisa V'Kuchibrichu Kul Echad. We learned in chapter 23. And at 24, the Alter Rebbe goes the other side. And therefore, everything that a person transgresses, God forbid, whether it's Taraisa or the Rabbanon, any little thing even. And I say little just because of language. By the Alter Rebbe, it's clearly not little, because everything is a defiance of the divine unity. And as such, is mamish like Avodah Zarah. Elikim acherim, and that's why it's encompassed in Lo Yilecha Elikim acherim. And then he explained even worse. It's worse. Because Elikim acherim, Avodah Zarah, and these things, now we're not talking about the transgression. The very forces, those are klippas that were put into place, and they don't have a guf, meaning they don't have a body. A human being has a body that chooses to transgress. These are all states of concealment. So he explains that the human being is even worse. He's even worse than the klippas and sitra achra that are called elikim acherim. And even worse than the forces that are derived from there. What he calls the shkotzim and amoshim, all the hemis tmeis and chayis tmeis, all the impure forces in this world, because none of them ever transgressed. They were put in place because God created a tzimtzum and concealed his presence. But when we act on it, we're actually giving body, guf, like he says, and a reality to the opposite of Hashem Echad, Elikim acherim. So if we never transgress, so these are things God put in the world. He put concealments. The tzimtzum is also part of Hashem's plan. And like we learned, that all these exist creations, they are in a state they never change what God put them there. They never change their function. And furthermore, as the Gemara says, that Kamaimer Yitush Kodmacha, that even an insect, a mosquito, preceded you, as we discussed at length in the previous class. That even a mosquito, which is the lowest klippa because it just takes and doesn't give, nevertheless, as I said, and for sure other chayis tmeis, ubali chayim atmeim as he puts it, who they never deviate from their divine role, their divine function. A human being, however, has deviated. And that's why he says indeed that animals, even animals, will not touch a human being because they see the divine image on him. That's a clear raya that they recognize and respect the divine. But that's only at tzaddik where you see that divine image. Not someone, God forbid, who sins, where therefore they don't see it. Nidme, like he says. Unless the person's divine image is concealed, back to concealed. That's why Daniel, Begeva Rayas, in the lion's den, they didn't touch him, as the Zohar explains. So b'meile, im kein achayte ve'ever etzenis barach afile b'aveda kala b'shas maisu b'tachlis harichuk. So b'shas he's doing a sin, he's utterly distant. Even a minor transgression, utterly distanced from God's holiness and God's unity, seamless unity at the moment of the sin. More than all the non-kosher animals, insects, and reptiles, which are powered by the sitra achra and the klippa of idolatry, of elikim acherim, Avodah Zarah. That's a summary to where we're up to. Now the Alter Rebbe, his classic and inimitable style, comes to Bavon as something critical. And again, this is so relevant to Purim, because Purim is about, that's what Haman represented, Avodah Zarah. Besides the fact that he saw himself as what, and they even said he had an Avodah Zarah, but it basically represents the antithesis to godliness. And Mordechai lo yichra v'lo yishtachave. Literally, they're not bowed, they're not in any way show deference to that. Because Mordechai Yehudi shemeide b'Hashem, and Kefer b'Avodah Zarah. That's why it's called Yehudi. So the connection is very, very, very clear. But now the Alter Rebbe comes to Bavon. If that's the case, that every Aveda, literally every transgression, even minor transgression, is equal to Elikim Acherim, to cutting yourself off from God, which a person is ready to die for, even if he's not on a high level. That means they should be ready to die for every minor transgression equally. Why? Because it's his very essence. It's not just Avodah Zarah. Every transgression is vital to his connection to God, and every transgression is a form of idolatry, as you just said, and worse. Worse than the klippus and sitra achra, and that which is mushpa from them, which he calls Avodah Zarah. So here comes a big question. So why is it the din that when it comes to pikuach nefesh, meaning when a person's life is in danger, there's only three things you're supposed to give your life for: Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Damim. Avodah Zarah, of course, is idolatry. Gilui Arayos is sexual impropriety, adultery, and Shvichas Damim, murder. And all the other mitzvahs, Pekuach Nefesh Deicha, Kol HaTeira Kula. If you're in danger, you're supposed to transgress. But they're all cut you off from God equally. They're all like Avodah Zarah. So why is there a distinction? That seems to indicate that there is a difference between Avodah Zarah. So when we talk about Kal Shebekalim and the Pesha Yisrael, why they will give their lives before they bow to Avodah Zarah, because it's touching, they feel the very essence of their connection. But other Avedas don't touch. How is that consistent with everything the Alter Rebbe just said? So that's the next piece in Tanya. So let's learn inside. So he says like this. As for the statement or the Talmudic principle that Pekuach Nefesh, saving one's life, takes precedence over all transgressions, except the three that I just mentioned. Well, what's relevant mostly to us is idolatry, but you could also say Gilui Arayos, because he did bring before about Isha Kisish, there's the Seita, Isha Kisishta, where he talked about Ein Adam Ever Avel Elam Ken Ruach Nichnas Bei Ruach Shtus. But there he actually said that part of the Ruach Shtus is convincing yourself that Niyuf, adultery, is not as bad as Avodah Zarah. But regardless, he did mention Gilui Arayos. He did talk about that. So we have a question here. Furthermore, in addition, the Alter Rebbe brings another statement, another halacha. Pekuach Nefesh is from Yuma Pei Beis Aleph, and Pei Hey Aleph and Beis, the Gemara Yuma. Then there's another din, Kam Yaver Val Yarek. That again, chutz from these three sins, if a person comes and says to you that I will kill you unless you do something to transgress a Torah principle, let's say the Gemara gives the example of Shabbos, Chil Shabbos, doing something on Shabbos. So we're not talking about a life-threatening situation. We're talking about somebody who's actively telling you, unless you do this, I will kill you. So it says, Yaver v'lo yarik. Yaver val yarik. Transgress and do not allow yourself to be killed. By the three that we talked about, Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Damim, and Gilui Arayis, we say Yarig Val Yaver. You should die before. So here again, the same question. If they're all, even the minor transgression has all that same element of being cut off from godliness and godly unity, that all-pervasive unity, why is that? Why is there a distinction? So the Alter Rebbe answers, it has nothing to do with the level of transgression. There's a specific reason why taka should a person not die, because Kepirish Chazal. The reason to transgress, there's a reason. Amra Teira, the Teira tells us, Chalal of Shabbos Achas Kedei Sheyishmer Shabbos Harba. The Gemara in Shabbos, Kuf Nun Aleph Beis, 151b says, by the way, the second Yaver Val Yarig is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Ayin Dalet Aleph, 74a. But here we're going back to this. He says, Amra Teira Chalal of Shabbos Achas Kedei Sheyishmer Shabbos Harba. Violate one Shabbos in order that he'll be able to observe many more Shabboses. That's what the Gemara tells us. So it's not because life obviously is the critical thing, most important thing, but because the transgression is ultimately not a transgression, it's actually allowing him to keep more Shabbosim. So if a person, let's say, sick, God forbid, and the only way to save him is to be Mechal Shabbos, so as the Eira Chaim says, that's actually Shmira Shabbos. Why? Because when he keeps Shabbos, if you let him violate, if he doesn't violate Shabbos, he may die, and if he dies, he can't keep any more Shabbos. Whereas if he transgresses, or as he puts it, he's not transgressing, he's keeping Shabbos, because of that, he can keep many Shabbosim afterwards. So in a sense, his momentary transgression is part of continuing to keep mitzvahs. It's part of keeping mitzvahs. So if the Aveda was cutting him off from God, period, then you'd say, no, you can't do that. That's the God's unity. That's our very oxygen. How could you cut off oxygen? What difference does it make if it's Aveda Zarah or if it's Chilul Shabbos? God forbid. Or any other minor transgression. It's taking away a person's life, God. But you're not taking away life, because it's actually adding that you'll continue to serve Hashem. So it's like holding your breath for a minute in order to have many more breaths afterwards. Example, obviously, holding your breath in a way that you don't die. So that's what's happening here. It's actually adding to his connection to Hashem. Kedei yishmeh Shabbos harba. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. V'lo mishum kalas averes v'chumron. And not because there's actually a distinction between one another where we say, these three are so critical to your connection to God that you have to die for before you are over them. And the rest are not so. No, they're all equally necessary. But it's because you're actually saving the life in order to keep doing mitzvahs. So it's not because of major and minor transgressions that evaluate which level of mitzvah or aveda it is. Now the Rebbe is going to bring a proof to this. You'll say, 1 second here. But same thing you could say about Aveda Zarah, Gilui Arayis, and Shvichas Damim. You could say the same thing. That if you're ever once, in order to be able to forever be connected properly. So the Alter Rebbe is going to say in a few lines from now that it's only mitzad Gzeres HaKosov. That the truth is that it would be that case as well, but there's a Gzeres HaKosov. And we'll talk about that more, because Gzeres HaKosov around those three. And there's many ways to discuss and explain it. We'll talk about that. But I want to go in order here before we get to that. Just wanted to bavor that. Okay. So now the Alter Rebbe brings a raya. Teda in the brackets. He brings a raya teda. Which means you should know, but it's also like a proof. That it's not due to the level of the severity or the mildness or the kalas or chumran of the Avedas, the major and minor transgression. He brings Teda, Shahari Shabbos Chamura V'Shkula Kaveda Zara. Because there are places we find that actually Shabbos is compared to Aveda Zara. Where? L'in Shchitas Mumar L'Dover Echad B'Yeda Deya Simen Beis. So you're talking about a sheikhet, someone who slaughters meat. He has to be trustworthy. How do you determine if he's trustworthy? So you see how he behaves. If he's Ever Aveda Zara, the Dover Echad, or Shabbos, you can't trust him. Mashenkein, says the Alter Rebbe, Mashenkein b'muma l'gilei arayis. If he's Ever on Gilei arayis, Achmana litzlan, you could trust him. So here seems to be what's going on. Gilei arayis seems to always be in the same category as Aveda Zara. And here, you could trust the sheikh at Gilei arayis, but Shabbos you can't. Shabbos is not like the Gimel Avedas. V'afilu hachi, and though this halach is in place, pekuach nefesh deiches Shabbos v'lei Gilei arayis. When there's danger to death, it's deiches Shabbos, but not Gilei arayis. How do you explain that? If it's due to chemer and kal, so Shabbos monofshach. If Shabbos is, you're ready to give, you don't die for Shabbos. You save a life, but, and here you say, and Gilei arayis, you don't, so why when it comes to shchitas differently? So the Alter Rebbe says, El digzeres hakosavu. So that tells you that it's due to digzeres hakosav. That's the Torah itself designated as such. It's not due to that logic. It's due to a super-rational Torah decree. And that tells you that this alone proves the case, that all mitzvahs, all Avedas are equal. And the only reason there's Pekuach Nefesh is Deicha one and not the other is Gzeres HaKosov. But we still have to ask the question, why Dafka these three? Even though it's Gzeres HaKosov, is there anything about them that really makes them stand out? Because at the end of the day, they're all equal. Everything is part of God's unity. And everything goes against God is against God's unity. You can't measure that. So we'll talk about this in the next shir. But Messiah and B'Tev should be again a Freilichen Purim, a Freilichen Shushim Purim, a Purim Meshulish, and we should connect to Hashem as the Yidden did by Purim then and they do today. And nothing then can hurt us, and Adarabah, it will only be like Yehudim, Heisa, Erev, Simcha, V'Sas, and V'Yikar. A good Avach, and a Freilichen Purim, and a Freilichen Tanit.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.